Okay, are we on? Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our first plenary session. I'm Tom Nuttall from the Economist magazine. Our session is titled Quo Vadis Europe. And for those of you like me who did not enjoy the benefits of a classical education, that means, where are you going, Europe? And because that's a rather large question and we have a rather large panel and not very much time to discuss it, I'm not going to waste any of it giving you my opinions. You can read them every week in The Economist. I'm going to turn it over to our panel straight away, and that should leave us plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So to briefly introduce them, to my right, your left, we have Jita Znamenackova. I hope I got that right, who runs the Department of EU Policy in the Czech Foreign Ministry. To her left, Michael Schaeffer, who is a 35-year veteran of the German Foreign Service, serving most recently in China until 2013, and today he is chairman of the BMW Foundation in Berlin. To Michael's left is Florian Bieber, who is a professor of Southeast European history and politics at the University of Graz in Austria, author of several books and advisor to ministries, international organizations and investors. To his left is Ian Bond, who is Director of Foreign Policy at the Centre for European Reform in London. Before that, he was a member of the British Diplomatic Service for 28 years, serving inter alia as political counsellor at the embassy in DC, and before that as ambassador to Latvia. To his left is Dušan Šiđanski, an author, political scientist, a former advisor to José Manuel Barroso, the president of the European Commission, and he's now based at the University of Geneva. And to his left is Stephen Blockmans, head of EU foreign policy at the Centre for European Policy Studies, which is one of the premier think tanks in Brussels. Okay, so, Jita, if you can kick us off with some perspective from Central Europe. Where I'm based in Brussels, the mood is brighter than at any time since I moved there 3 years ago. Is it like that in Prague?
Yeah, thank you, Tom, to give me the floor. Brussels, Prague, Belgrade, I think that the mood towards the EU or Europe should be the same. I'm really glad to be here under the panel Quo Vadis Europe. Of course, I have no answer for the question or the crystal ball to predict future. What kind of offer is kind of a Central European view and some remarks from our perspective. Well, we got used to, in the EU, to our mantra saying that we are living in challenging times. Definitely true, but Europe was always in challenging times, and it's twice valid for this Western Balkan region. And of course, now we are facing Brexit, migration crisis, Catalonian declaration of the independence. But what I have in my mind is that before there was always some kind of crisis, being financial, economic downfall, or something else, and. We should keep in our mind that EU has always been an ambitious project, and we should keep it that way. What I want to underline, and this is kind of a red line of my intervention, is that the EU works. Maybe it needs some improvements, but it works. And the EU is not a static formation, it's the process, and it's a never-lasting process. When you finish with one directive, there is always another one to be implemented. And we in the Czech Republic and respectively in the Central Europe might not like the gun directive, for example, or relocations. But we are keeping in our mind why the EU project was starting and why we joined as the Czech Republic in. There are currently some of interesting speeches behind us. I mean, Mr. Juncker's and Mr. Macron's speeches and ideas about the future of Europe, need of further convergence and some other ideas. Some of them we share from the Czech Republic's perspective. Some of them we are a bit cautious about. From the geopolitical perspective, we definitely live in turbulent times. What we have to keep in our mind is balanced foreign policy. Even there are quite differences in foreign policy in the EU itself. And in our geopolitical situation in the Central Europe, we really think that we should keep transatlantic eye and ties, and that this is vital for the EU. In regards of some Juncker's and Macron's ideas on multi-speed Europe, this is a bit sensitive issues in our voters. As you all know, the Czech Republic is not part of the eurozone, but it doesn't mean that we don't want to make structural, social, and other reforms. No, we want to be on track, and we want to follow the convergence in the EU. We definitely accept the challenge of Monsieur Juncker and Monsieur Macron to be part of the core of the EU. Anyway, some of ideas that the core should be based on of the eurozone members are for us a bit sharp and need to be discussed further. So. What
Jita,
is...
I may ask you to save your thoughts so we can move along.
Yeah,
but
sure.
We can come back to you.
I haven't realized my 5 minutes up, so...
Don't worry, we'll have plenty of time to come back to you. But if I can move on to you, Michael. I mean, one of the reasons for the optimism that's around in Europe at the moment is a sense that with the election of Emmanuel Macron, there's a possibility of Franco-German renewal in the air. Can you give us some perspective from Berlin on that? If there is a possibility of Franco-German revival, what might it look like? What might the results be?
Well, first of all, let me say that I don't share the optimism. I don't share the optimism because I think it would be a superficial analysis if we would think that after Brexit, when everyone saw the European Union go down the drain, and after Trump came into power, the European Union was, so to say, a lost project. Now, just because Macron has been elected, our problems are gone. I think we are facing a deep crisis of identity in the European Union. And the crisis of identity is one where you have one part of our populations, in most of our populations, which is tending to be more inward-looking, nationalist. I'm not talking about rightist populism, but I'm looking at those 30% who are Eurosceptics and not nationalists in the narrow sense of the word. And then you have the other part of our populations which thinks liberal democracy is what we have established in the last 70 years and which has been the firm basis for giving Europe prosperity and peace. If or if not, Macron can, so to say, restore enough dynamism into the European Union process is an open question. I hope he does, but that indeed requires that not only the German government is going to respond positively to Macron's ideas, but that we form a group of countries who are active enough to take this new vision forward. Dušan was talking about a core group of countries in a recent article. Whatever you call it, I think we need an avant-garde which is capable and willing to do that. In Germany, it's still too early to say if the new government is going to have that kind of both inspiration and power. I think we are going to have coalition between the Conservative Party, the CDU, CSU, the Green Party, and the Liberals. By the way, a coalition which I personally think could be much more dynamic and positive than any of the great coalitions which we have had in the last, let's say, 8 or 10 years. So I'm not, so to say, pessimistic that this is going to be the end of a pro-European course. On the contrary. But we need to do our homeworks first, and then I think we need to get together with Macron, but not only, also with the Italians, some of the smaller countries, because I think we need to identify what we want. Talking about a political union is not sufficient. You have to know what this political union is all about. If we are looking at the security and defense area, it looks much different from what a social union would look like, which would, again, look different if you look at the monetary and financial union. I think we need to identify a way forward which is, I think, so to say, revolutionary in the sense of breaking the bureaucratic, slow movement forward. We need a leap forward. On the other hand, you must not leave behind key interests of our member states. So if I can give an example, in the monetary union, I don't think it is sufficient to say we, so to say, create a euro budget and a finance minister. You have to know what this budget is going to provide. And here I think the devil is, as always, in the detail. We need to be, I think, extremely sensitive to the fact that Germans are always afraid of paying the bill at the end of the day, which I think is fair enough, because we have shown a lot of solidarity. On the other hand, other populations in the European Union need support, and we are ready and should be ready to give that support. So you need this kind of balance. Same with the labor union. I think jobs is what people expect the European Union to provide. So we need somehow to tackle the issues which are, so to say, on the agenda. Let me give you again one example.
Okay, briefly.
Digitization. Digitization is, in the eyes of many people, great concern. They think, I'm going to lose my job tomorrow. Yes, 40% of jobs will be lost because of digitization. But 42% of new jobs we know already today will arise. And nobody knows what kind of sectors will, so to say, be built. I think this is a question where the European Union should help to, for instance, retrain people for the next 5 or 10 years to come. Okay. Erasmus Plus could be a framework where we would say we are not only to support academics, but also people who have dual training or practical training. So I think that would be something to discuss.
Okay, we'll dig into the economic issues in a bit more detail in a bit. Florian, we're sitting in Belgrade. A lot of your work has focused on the Western Balkans, a region that has, some might say, been rather neglected by the European Union in recent years, to the extent that there is a sense of possibility in the air that's been opened up by the fact that some of the crises of recent years have receded, and some of the elections of the past year as well. To what extent do you think it can and ought to focus on this neighbourhood?
Well, thanks. I think, first of all, the framework is really important because I would say that in the last years, enlargement in the Western Balkans has been going by stealth rather underneath the radar, and it's been this kind of very technical process. And this is part of the larger problem of the European Union. I mean, it's the crisis management mode where some things were just continuing, and this might have been beneficial in that period. Now, I think what we need to move on is to, in a certain way, repoliticize this, make this a political process again. With the larger EU and with a larger kind of revival of the European Union debates as well. So it's not just about the enlargement, but it should be embedded in, when we're talking about what Europe should look like 10 years down the road, we should think about it with the Western Balkans in mind and as part of it. So it's rather than thinking about two separate tracks, what does Europe look like and what about the enlargement, rather bring the two together and saying, well, what's this joint project? And I think it was a big pity that when we had the commemoration of the Rome treaties earlier, that there was no participation of the future member states from the Western Balkans. Symbolically, I think this was a big mistake, and I think recent statements by Jean-Claude Juncker have been more encouraging, but it's still not this visionary step of saying we have to think about the EU in 10 or 15 years, and that includes the Western Balkans, which have this very clear perspective. So it's about repoliticizing Europe to some degree, making it not a technocratical issue, which also means bringing in the values. So I think this is in a certain way a paradox, but I think an important one is like if we're talking about a political union in the sense that not as a technical union, we have to reaffirm the values of democracy. And that has to be something which includes a more critical stance towards some member states who are violating basic democratic principles. And there have to be clearer measures taken against them, because otherwise we cannot talk of shared values if some governments violate, and have poster campaigns spreading, propaganda and lies against individuals and groups, and seething with anti-Semitism. I mean, this is unacceptable in the European Union. And also that is the kind of politicization and kind of clear defense of values which is important towards the Western Balkans, because also here the group, the Balkans and Europe Policy Advisory Group, which I'm part of, we've kind of noted this, what we call the stabilitocracy, the kind of authoritarian mixture of pro-European yet autocratic rule at home. And that is, that can technically maybe become a member of the European Union. But if we're talking about a European Union which is founded on values, then a government like that should not be in the European Union. And that's something we have to be clear. So on one side, be more inclusive, saying these countries should be brought in, thinking about them already earlier than just thinking about it like a technical process. But that also means being more offensive and being more straightforward about the values the European Union should stand for and defend publicly.
Thank you very much. Ian, so we've just been discussing, as it were, the inner courtyard of the EU. Maybe if I can ask you to look at the neighbourhood and the world beyond a little bit. The EU has a few more foreign policy tools now than it did in the past as a result of the Lisbon Treaty. It doesn't yet have what you might call a common foreign and security policy. What do you think the chances are of that?
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Actually, I challenge that. I think in many respects the EU has done surprisingly well on preserving a consensus on many foreign policy issues, whether it's Iran or sanctions against Russia over the last 3 years or whatever. We haven't done too badly. But it does seem to me that although I agree with a lot of what I've heard about how the EU should be arranging or rearranging things internally, there's a real risk that we miss what's going on outside. And the fact is that at the moment, there are some pretty big threats to the European Union that are coming from the outside, and not always from the places that you would expect. I mean, I fundamentally expect that Vladimir Putin will be trying to undermine the European Union. He's one of the great disruptors, and this is as good a way as any to disrupt. But for the first time in 70 years, we're finding the US and Europe on opposite sides of the debate about what I would call, what many have called the liberal international order. And particularly if you look at economics, if you look at free trade, some of the things that have made both Europe and the US and also countries like China and India much more prosperous over the last 70 years. Open markets, free trade, and a structure of international rules, those are being challenged by a US president, and I find that absolutely extraordinary. And it seems to me, against that background, the EU has got to look beyond its borders and work out how does it preserve the foundations of its own prosperity, of the globalization from which it has benefited over those many years. And how do you work with partners who may share an interest in keeping those fundamental pillars of globalization in some ways, but don't share the EU's liberal and democratic values in others? Xi Jinping turned up at the World Economic Forum this year, proclaiming himself a champion of this liberal international order. And that may be true on an economic front, but it's certainly not true on the side of democracy. How does the EU deal with that? I don't think we have an answer to that. Closer to home, I think the EU has to look at its neighbourhood. There is barely a country in the EU's neighbourhood that could be said to be doing very well. You have problems of corruption, conflict, irregular migration. Now, in the past, after the Cold War, the EU's answer was enlargement, and enlargement was hugely successful. But many of the problem neighbours now are either never going to be eligible to be EU members, or are so far away from converging with the rest of the EU that it's going to take them 20 years or more to get in. And I think the EU has to be looking at other ways in which it can relate to neighbouring countries, other ways in which it can try to share some of the advantages of membership without taking on the full panoply of all of the EU's rules and regulations. And it does seem to me that set against the scale of those challenges outside its borders, really debates on whether the eurozone could be better governed, or whether we could do a better job on rule of law are somewhat important, but they're really not the existential threats that we think. And least of all Brexit. Let me just say as a Brit, I think Brexit is an existential threat to the UK. I think it's nothing more than a temporary annoyance to the rest of the EU.
Thank you, Ian. One of the emerging debates in the EU now, and Jita mentioned it in passing, is it's really the return of this debate over different countries inside the EU moving at different speeds. We heard Emmanuel Macron the other day repeat his suggestion that some countries ought to move faster than others. Michael himself spoke about an avant-garde. Jean-Claude Juncker, in his State of the Union speech, by contrast, held out the prospect of all the institutions for all of the countries. So I wanted to ask you for some perspective on that. But also, do you think that it's these sorts of debates, these sort of institutional debates, that might distract from the sorts of issues that Ian was just talking about?
You are asking me?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It's okay?
Mm-hmm.
Hello? Oui. Thank you. I will, at the beginning, say that the crisis we have today in the euro is completely different from the other crises we had before. I will take the example of three main crises in the euro. If you take the crisis of defense community, which collapsed with the political community also, then the second was about Yugoslavia, in which it appeared that history is not completely absent from the conflicts, and there was a very big tension between France and Germany. Third, the difference with today's crisis is that we have 3 or 5 threats to European Union. It's not one simultaneously. And if you take one after other, Euro can survive with some type of political authority and more democratic way. If you take the immigration, the situation is very unstable, and you take the other problems like terrorism, defense, security all together. And what is very important, at the same time, we have threats from outside. So you have a combination. If you logically analyze this situation, you will see that EU has no power to respond. This happens in the union debate with Juncker and so on. And what Macron said? Macron said, we need a sovereign Europe, which means all these threats have the response in the powers, in the sovereign powers. You cannot have Euro without authority, political authority, in long way. You cannot respond to the problem of foreign affairs. Somebody said it's going very well. I don't believe Europe has no foreign policy, really. It's France or Germany and so on. France intervened in Mali without saying anything to others. We need some cohesion in this way. And you cannot have defense, security without political control. Democracy has a principle that all securities, defense, are always submitted to the political authority. And we don't have political authority. So union is now the problem, what to do and how to do. I think we have to divide two problems. Now what we should do in priority, use, for example, the enhanced cooperation which exists in the treaty. 9 to 10 states can go and have a political core, which will then increase in dynamic energy for the European Union. It is not I agree, it's no two-speed Europe. It's the way in which we have to promote, and this is the only global vision of these all political problems. If you look at these problems, you observe that you cannot solve one without interacting with the others. So you have a complex interaction between all these threats to Europe. These threats are also inside. They provoked austerity imposed by Germany. Then we had pauperization in many countries. The situation, even Germany, is not so incredibly excellent as we think many times. Even Macron said, and Hollande always referring to the German model. I don't believe. Germany has also inside problems, very important problems. If you look, They are 3% of unemployed people. But what are employment? What are the jobs you have? So you have to have a distinct view of these problems. I think that now we need generally push. And we have Macron, but Macron has no clear view. I analyzed all the discourses, all the speeches of Macron. He thinks still that he can refound all the Europe. We have no time to refund now. We have to create jobs. We have to create political authority to respond to the threats and to the challenges. This is the only moment we can do something for Europe. And the way is we have not time. This is the problem. And you have a simultaneous problems. So the global view is necessary, and global view depends on political authority or political. And this, if you go back, for example, for Euro, you have the 92 Buba, Central Bank of Germany, said without political union in the future, the success of Euro is with question mark. This I found this all. The follow of that was in 94 when Lammers and Schäuble proposed a core area and especially based on Franco-German. Today you have quite different situation. Germany is very big and important country, most important power in economy. But France is most important today in military, in many political aspects. So we have not to limit our core area to those two countries. We have to take inside Italy, Spain, Portugal, even Greece, to give them new dynamic. And this will be the hope also for your countries, not only for us. I mean for the avant-garde. Avant-garde is necessary. And I will conclude that if you go to the literature, political, Karl Deutsch, who was the #1 on political science in the United States, studied all the federations in the world, successful and not successful. And the conclusion was, without a core area, you cannot have a success. You must have somebody who will give hope and dynamic, which is not the case in many countries today, because they are split inside. And I will not speak about Catalonia, which is also another problem of splits inside the countries.
Yes, I'm sure someone will get to Catalonia. Stephen, you can bring us home, as it were. Multispeed, todos por todos, or is that the wrong question?
It's not a wrong question if it's being posed by everyone, I suppose. There's a clear dichotomy as to the way forward being defined in some of the speeches. Juncker, of course, the arch-federalist, making a last attempt at forging his own legacy, pleading EU à la 27. And of course Macron, much more clearly, as has been said, on the idea of an avant-garde, which in his own Jupiterian way he would probably like to lead. Now, we were at a conference earlier where, the German-French alignment, as if it were, which is necessary for such an avant-garde, was discussed, and which is only possible, perhaps, if a grand bargain can be made on the side of security and defense, where France calls the shots, and EMU, where Germany, of course, calls them. But there are fundamental differences, of course, in both sides. On the EMU, big differences in the welfare state models, in the labor market models, growth models, which are hard to overcome. and in the security and defense sphere, obviously, Lilliput versus the only remaining nuclear power-wielding member state with a seat on the Security Council and expeditionary warfare capacity. I don't see where this multi-speed Europe could further develop, frankly. Political union has been said, very difficult to forge. Social union, transfer union. So we're left really with what we already have, EMU, Schengen. You'll probably see some efforts being made in strengthening those structures, and the additional common security and defense policy, where, as Federica Mogherini is fond of saying, more progress has been made in the last months, 20 months or so, than in the last 20 years, which is maybe true, with an attempt at creating permanent structured cooperation and to launch it at the European Council Summit in December, but potentially opening up new cleavages, which some of those countries that do not belong to the eurozone and to Schengen may want to join in order to define its course. Now, it's very well to say that you only need 9 or 10 member states to legally launch PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, but if you have 22 signing up for that, then effectively you will maintain a level of unanimity decision-making for the years to come, effectively thus always going for the lowest common denominator. So practically I think things will more or less, stay as they are, develop a little bit along the lines sketched out, not in the great leap forward that maybe the European Union is in need of, but frankly I don't share the level of pessimism in describing the political mood as to where we are. I think the existential crisis to the European Union, the fear which we all probably had prior to the French presidential elections, I think is gone. There is a renewed debate about the potential for building up, and practically so. So I think the mood music is important in this respect and should be heeded. To me, I see progress in all of these areas going on, and it's necessary, but it will probably happen in a functional way, à la méthode Monet, step by step, where I see the biggest challenge, and that is a result, I think, of what was dubbed as, the decisive electoral year 2017 throughout Europe, is the danger within, not so much the danger from the outside, but the danger within. The danger from an erosion of liberal values, the values on which the European Union is based, with an institutional and legal framework, a toolbox which is insufficient in dealing with them. That creates new fissures throughout the European Union, not just in Central and Eastern Europe, where you have the Orbanistas really rolling back some of the constitutional agreements which were necessary in order to become a member state of the European Union, but effectively also setting the agenda, framing the debate on issues which pertain to all, migration in particular. And again, a reference to the debate we had in the last couple of days. They've been able to frame how we approach this issue, and we see it as a problem, as a threat, rather than as an opportunity. But they have been able to shape that debate. That will continue, and the EU is, as of yet, unable to really tackle those issues.
I just want to follow up on that, or at least to use it as a bouncing off point to put something to Jita. I mean, we're going to have an election in the Czech Republic in just over a week or so. And it strikes me that some of the issues that we've been talking about present perhaps some dilemmas for a country like the Czech Republic. You're not in the euro, but you're deeply plugged into the eurozone, its supply chains, its labour market to a certain extent. There's been some sort of debate inside the country, but I don't think there's any sort of consensus that euro membership is on the cards anytime soon. Similarly, on migration, I mean, you mentioned relocation, something that the Czech government has been very sceptical about about, but there is still a big push. It might be sort of subterranean now, but it's still going on, to forge some sort of common consensus inside the EU about how to manage migration internally. Now, your government is not yet like the Polish one or the Hungarian one. We'll see what happens after the following election. So where does that mean you end up on debates like this? Do you feel now that there is a fresh push for sort of integration on issues like this, that the Czechs might feel that they have to move in one direction decisively or the other?
Well, I can talk hours on that, but I restrain myself for a few lines. I still think that the core of the EU should be 27, sorry to Brits. Elections in the Czech Republic is unpredictable because it will really depend on numbers we got from elections. Probably some of positions of the Czech Republic on topics you mentioned, migration, euro, will not change after the elections. I would rather sit here on the chair of a country who already accepted euro and who has positive lines on terms of relocations, but I have to deal with my political reality in my country. So one sentence on euro. We will have discussion and we make a clear signal to the eurozone. If there is a will, the Czech Republic is willing to have observer status in Eurogroup and to be at least part of some information sharing and some of the debate. On migration, this is really hard one. Everybody knows about our stand or our political stand on relocation. It is based on our public view. But what we emphasized always, this is the migration crisis is about comprehensive approach. Is about dealing with external aspects as well of internal ones. We were against obligatory relocations, were outvoted, and then there were some political consequences. But we are ready to help. We are helping Western Balkans in dealing with migration crisis, and we contribute to Africa as well. So I stop here. I really don't have a crystal ball. I personally hope that our new government will have a positive view on EU.
I want three of you mentioned in various ways this issue of the rule of law, values inside the EU, the danger that's posed by governments that seem to violate some of the obligations that they signed up to when they joined the European Union. So I wanted to sort of drill down into that a little bit more. And maybe, Ian, if I can ask you, I mean, you devoted your pitch, as it were, to the dangers of sort of institutional navel-gazing getting in the way of assembling a foreign policy that is equal to some of the fresh challenges that have emerged outside of the European Union. But what about these internal challenges posed by the rule of law? I mean, if we're thinking about how to manage our foreign policy challenges, are these sort of internal rule of law issues, are they really nothing more than distractions, or are they more serious than that?
I think the rule of law issue is actually more serious, but the institutional tinkering is not going to deal with it. And fundamentally, it's going to take some political will from leaders in other European countries. I mean, let's name some names. If Viktor Orban is in fact rolling back much of the reform that's taken place over the last 25 years or more in his country. And if he's cracking down on the media and launching rather sinister and somewhat anti-Semitic campaigns against George Soros, well, where is the European People's Party, of which Fidesz is a member? What have they to say on this subject? And the answer is nothing. So it seems to me that we can think a lot about institutional mechanisms, rule of law mechanism, Article 7 of the treaty, which gives you quite a lot of power to suspend the voting rights of countries that are not complying with the values of the organisation. But at bottom, this is about will. And if the other member states are not prepared to say to Orban, you're not behaving like a member of our club, then we're not going to get anywhere.
Well, of course, the most senior member of the European Council that belongs to the European People's Party is Angela Merkel, who has just been re-elected to a fourth term as Chancellor. Michael, I mean, you brought up your concerns about the rule of law inside the EU. Should we expect more from the Chancellor, to hear more from her on this?
Well, I expect more from any of our leaders in the European Union. I think what Ian has said is key to real changes within, which are a prerogative of real changes of making the European Union capable of acting to the outside. Rule of law is the cornerstone of our union. And that means that not only in terms of our own national frameworks we need to be honest, and that is true to many of our countries, not only to Hungary and Poland, but in particular to those two. I think our government should be very conscious of the fact that any tinkering with this principle of rule of law is weakening the very prospect and strength of the European Union. So that is the first point. Second point is, as we look outside, and Ian has referred to our neighborhood, obviously our neighborhood is fragile. But it's fragile for many different reasons. And I don't think we can just, so to say, make one policy statement in view of the European Union's capability of handling that. But one element is almost common to all of these societies, and that's the lack of rule of law. I mean, I've just been in Tunis, probably the only society which has, to a certain extent, survived what many people called a spring, which I think has never been a spring, and which is a very dark chapter of development in the Arab world. In Tunisia, rule of law is in danger because old elites, which are still part of corrupt circles, are, so to say, framing the new society, which is true to all transitional societies. If you have a society in transition, you cannot allow the old elites, which very often have been part of corrupt elites, to run the country. You need at least to get elements in society which are mostly local authorities, like mayors, like representatives of religious organizations, of universities, and so on, to be a vibrant part of building rule of law bottom up, and not only allow elites to, so to say, settle on a notion of rule of law top down. So I think this is really the key issue, not only for the European Union internally, but I think to make it fit to be an external actor with a certain amount of credibility.
Florian, I mean, you touched upon this in your introductory remarks, but give us a sense of how these sorts of rule of law issues inside the EU are perceived in the neighbourhood, and perhaps in the Western Balkans in particular, which has got to be the main sort of testing ground for the sorts of issues that Michael was talking about. When politicians here or other political actors see the Polish government tampering with the judiciary, when they see Viktor Orban challenging some of the foundations on which the European Union has been built, how do they react to it, and what sort of challenges does that represent to the EU when it's trying to manage its internal neighbourhood?
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's the right question. I mean, I think we see a twofold response. On one side, we see the kind of public response of saying the EU measures with double standards, right? So this is the accusation which particularly the government of this country likes to always level at the European Union, which is easily said. Of course, the counter argument is to say it's in the enlargement process that requirements are different than within the European Union. That's a problem in itself, but that's a structural nature of the EU. That's one response. The other one is, of course, emulation. It's seeing that this is a role model. I think governments in the region, in the Western Balkans, are looking both southeast, as we saw, let's say, towards Turkey or towards Russia, but also towards Hungary as a potential model. And what is also, of course, the problem that if we see Viktor Orban's Hungary promoting enlargement, it undermines the credibility of enlargement in the eyes of any other EU member states, because they're seeing it as, do they want to bring kind of little copycats of their own rule of law understanding into the European Union? And that puts, I think, many supporters of enlargement on the defensive, because it sees it not as being bringing in countries for the sake of bringing in rule of law-based democracies, but rather multiplying these kind of semi-autocratic rulers. And I think that is one fundamental problem we have. And I think that is where the EU is losing credibility. And I think what we're getting as a result is this argument of saying from some member states, I would say like the Netherlands, for example, very rigid, saying we have to, any member state, future member state has to fulfill every criteria. We're not going to be letting anybody through anymore who's breaking any rules. But of course, the problem is once you're in, you can break those rules. And, it's not that only new member states are immune to that. I mean, Austria, a country where I live, is electing a new government this weekend. And the leading candidates have been falling over backwards in terms of saying who has met Orban more often and who is better friends with him. So, this is not something which is, only a phenomena of countries which joined over the last 15 years.
Ian told us that Brexit doesn't matter for anyone except for Britain. But is there a Brexit dimension to this? Not only because Britain is one of the loudest and most important foreign policy players inside the EU while it remains inside the EU, but traditionally, of course, it has always been one of the big champions of enlargement. Now, there is a slightly sort of paradoxical situation going on at the moment where Britain is continuing to bang the drum for enlargement to the Balkans at precisely the time it's negotiating its own departure. But that aside, as Britain leaves and as its voice becomes less important inside the EU, is that going to have an impact on the sorts of issues that you're talking about?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think we're seeing one of the main proponents of enlargement falling out of the equation or not being a credible actor anymore. Of course, we've seen some countries stepping up, but the problem, as I was pointing out, they are countries where the governments are not credible actors. And in a certain way, they're not leading by example, they're rather leading by their rhetoric. So in that sense, at the moment, Germany is quite alone when it comes to promoting enlargement. It has, of course, Italy maybe as a partner. And Austria, which has been quite important in promoting enlargement to the Western Balkans, might fall by the wayside next week, because we might have an incoming government which will include the far-right Freedom Party, which is rhetorically very pro-Serbian, but that seems to be more of an electoral ploy than commitment to enlargement. So in that sense, it's going to be certainly likely to be a government which is more closed and more inward-looking than the previous one. And that, of course, will mean that enlargement might lose another advocate, at least one credible advocate it had. And that, of course, is a challenge. And, enlargement cannot be carried by Germany alone or a few other countries. It needs a broader coalition. And that's something which we're not really having so clearly at the moment.
Dušan, I'm going to switch tack entirely now. I want to talk about economics, and I want to talk about the eurozone in particular. Michael brought it up earlier. After Emmanuel Macron's election, and partly because he campaigned on a promise to bring change to the eurozone and to revamp its architecture. This conversation, which had entirely fallen away for the last few years, all of a sudden it's back, and we're thinking about things like completing the banking union, about institutional changes to the eurozone, and so on and so forth. How realistic do you think the prospects are for meaningful change, and in particular for a Franco-German bargain on some of the issues on which they've differed for so long?
As I said at the beginning, I don't believe we have to concentrate only on Germany and France. We have Italy, we have other countries which are very important for the equilibrium which we need in the Europe. Secondly, I think that if you take the eurozone, for example, eurozone is intergovernmental, not transparent, not under the authority as a euro should be political authority, no democratic control, no democratic preparation, and so on. So what should be done is not to take the eurozone, as Macron proposed in some way, to have a parliament of eurozone. It's much better to take the parliamentary representative inside the Euro Parliament and gave them the vote for Eurozone, not to split in this case. Secondly, I think that, as I perceived at least here, that some are still for the Jean Monnet method, which was step by step. And finally, step by step, we will finish with a political union. This is not possible. Political union needs a new voluntary act. You cannot just step by step go in some way. On the contrary, what is very important from Jean Monnet, which we don't have respected very well, is the community decision-making, which involves, in legislative function, involves the Parliament and the Council. This is something very... Secondly, we forget that the only institution which is responsible to the Parliament is the Commission. And the Commission proposed, for example, 5 models to the government members. But I wrote an open letter to Juncker saying you have not to propose the choice to the government, you have to have a project. This is the Commission. The Commission has proposals, the only institution in some way, with the Parliament. So this is a very... Secondly, we cannot wait. Merkel went to Warsaw and asked, we will refound the European Union. The answer from the government was, we will be very happy because we will take back some of the powers. It's the contrary what we need, is not to take back the powers of the European Union, but to strengthen this European Union. Third point is that foreign policy, for example, in relation with Russia, with sanctions, we followed all the American sanctions and so on. I think it was a great error from the beginning. The creation of partnership, you remember the 6 countries Oriental Partnership, was without Russia. I asked Barroso many times, why do you not propose to have the partnership guaranteed by European Union and Russia? Not to isolate Russia, what we did. We contributed to the stability of Putin by having the sanctions. But the sanctions have very negative effect inside in Europe, because some who are exporters to Russia are not allowed now to export. Greece, Holland, for example, Italy, they are stopped. So you have much more division inside European Union. The other problem you mentioned was the migration. It's divided. The lady said we don't want quotas. I'm sorry if the decision in the European Union was taken for quotas, and why not? You have to follow, to respect what was taken, not to say we don't want what is the Warsaw. Many countries, there are 5 countries which are taking on the authoritarian regimes. They are following this type of track. These are the fundamental division we have. If you have a good election of Macron, it doesn't mean that the National Party, French, le Front National, disappear. They represent a force inside France still. So in Germany, even if it's not a big victory from the extreme party, AfD, in otherwise, there is a cleavage inside our countries. We have to pay attention there. Our values, I am sorry, the rule of law is not always respected. And the enlargement was a very formal approach of the European Union. Do you have rules of law? Yes, we respect. But who in some countries, members today, respect the rules?
Okay, before we go to the floor for questions, let me just ask you, Stephen, if you have any concluding thoughts. Your first intervention was rather more upbeat than what we heard from the rest of the panelists. Have they said anything since to change your mind?
Well, I would like to pick up on some of the points which were just raised. On the question who leads Europe, we've seen in the crisis period that the European Council, the heads of state or government, have stepped up to the plate and took emergency decisions, which have held so far. They're incomplete. They have been made in backroom deals. Thereby suffering from, what political scientists would call throughput legitimacy, intransparent. They've upset an institutional balance which existed. And so the question now becomes that 2 things, I think. On the one hand, is this becoming the new normal? Are the heads of state or government now effectively engaging in a formal sense of decision-making, a role which is not attributed to them in the treaties, and effectively bringing the Council and the Commission to heel, if you want, as executive agencies for political decisions, which admittedly they can take very well in crisis situations because they lend authority, of course, through the fact that all of these people have won elections at home. But is this the new normal? That's the question. And does it thereby upset the normal way of market integration that we've seen so far? So I think there's 2 level playing field here. There's the big politics, which is dealt with at that level, and admittedly needs that type of legitimacy which is granted to the political leaders. At the same time, you have the single market and all the regulation which is necessary to keep the whole thing afloat. So how do you marry the 2? That's I think one of the big questions that we will have to resolve.
Yeah, and just as a coda to that, I think the Catalan crisis, in a sense, demonstrates that point. The Catalans, it was clear to me, were seeking and perhaps expecting a little bit more support from perhaps some European governments and also members of the European Parliament. They got very little, and the support that they did get probably came from quarters that they didn't want. The European Council, the heads of government, they're still where the action is, they're still what matter, and when it comes to the crunch on an issue like this, they showed an extraordinary degree of unity, much to the detriment of the Catalans and to the delight of the Spanish government. I want to turn it over to the floor now. I don't know if we have a roaming microphone. Do we? We do? Yep, okay, well maybe we can take 2 or 3 questions and then we'll come back to the panel. So please raise your hand, tell us who you are, keep it brief. We'll take one over there.
Kurt Bassiner, Democratization Policy Council on University of St. Andrews. Just to tie a few points together and gauge a reaction, particularly from Mr. Schaeffer and Dr. Bieber. Both of you sort of intimated that there's the liberal democratic constituency, both in the European Union and in the Western Balkans, hasn't really been cultivated. There's always been this presumption that follows from democratic practice. We've seen now that that's not the case, that it's been untended. Do you have any ideas on how that might be sparked? Because I don't see the leadership for addressing that from the bottom up, as you said, Mr. Schaeffer, and I completely agree. I'm not seeing any impetus for that right now, and I'm just seeing it. Do you see something that I don't?
Okay, thank you. We had a question on the far left over there.
Goran Buldilski, Open Society Foundations, based in Budapest. Can I ask a bit of imagination on the panel in which they, if you can exercise a certain scenario, you have countries like Hungary, where I live, going backwards in their democratic development, and they're officially accepted in a second track, or third or fourth track, but they still remain inside the European Union. And then you have countries like Serbia, where actually the democratic standards are poor, but probably not worse than what they're now in Hungary. Can you imagine the Balkan entering on such a ticket in European Union? Yes to the market, no to the democracy?
Thank you, and we'll take one more, if we have any. Yep, please, here in the middle.
Thank you. Andreas Eskisten, University of Copenhagen. I'll keep it very brief. I would just like to hear your opinion on what is the Union's interest in enlargement on the Western Balkans. If you could shed light of all the different aspects, it would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe Florian, do you want to pick up on, well, I think actually any of those questions could be applied to you. You might want to group your answers to some of them together.
Kurt's question, I don't see it yet. I mean, I think there isn't this kind of clear initiative from below which would change this dynamic. I think we see the crisis of established political parties. We haven't talked about that. The crisis of democracy in many ways is still very pertinent, and it's not just reflected in right-wing populism, but in more broad crises, which we don't have an answer yet. I think we know the problem, but we don't know what is the way, whether it's going back to established political parties which just have to offer something else, or different mechanisms of transmitting voters' concerns. But I think there's a void which needs to be filled, which I think we have to think about, but that would be a way bigger debate than we have time here. But to Goran's question, I can't imagine Serbia joining the European Union as not a country which fully adheres to the rule of law, and that includes democracy, because I think there might be some EU member states which are eager to have a country like that in the European Union, but I think there will be too many who will pull the emergency brakes, and I think they are going to be more numerous and more influential at the end of the day, unless the European Union overall turns to a illiberal rule and abuse of the rule of law. But I don't think that's going to be the case. I think countries like the Netherlands, but also Germany, will certainly not be very eager to accept at the end of the day. I mean, I think the governments of the EU member states have often not been critical enough to many of the governments in the region. I mean, when we're talking about Macedonia under the previous government, when we're talking about Serbia, Montenegro, I mean, nearly any government in the region can be put in that list. They haven't been critical enough, but I think their lack of criticism is more a reflection of their lack of commitment to enlargement. I think they certainly wouldn't necessarily like to see all of the gentlemen, and they are mostly gentlemen, who are governing at the same table in the European Union. So I think they would pull the brakes at the end of the day. So I don't think that's a likely scenario.
Okay, Michael, did you have any thoughts?
Well, I mean, basically, I do agree with Florian's positions. The first question is complicated. I don't think there is the one way of tackling this problem, because it has emerged in the last 15, 20 years. This is not a new development. And I think one of the problems which we also see in the whole enlargement process, and that's true not only to the Balkans, it has been true to Romania, Bulgaria, and some of the Eastern European countries, is that we have not really allowed these countries to find their own national identity. And part of their national identity is, I think, the value base that they should or have not yet chosen. This is true to Poland, certainly. The European Union has served as a good bank in order to finance the infrastructure, and once that process of physical restoration was gone, I think the problem of really joining a union which is more than, so to say, an economic club started. Now, if you take this issue into, I think, the rest of the periphery of the European Union, I think we need to reflect about new ways of encouraging people bottom up to develop rule of law. I think we need to work more with local populations. I think civil society has a much greater role to play. We cannot install rule of law top-down only. Of course, there needs to be a framework, but so to say, within that framework, you need to work with civil organizations, companies. I think enterprises have a much greater responsibility in working here. So you need really a coalition of forces building this awareness of liberal values which are the base of our societies. And that brings me to the other two questions of Goran's scenario and also the question Andreas has put. I think at this point in time, it is very unlikely that any of the 27, including my own country, Germany, which is favorable of, so to say, bringing the Western Balkans on board in the medium-term perspective, it is very unlikely that we are going to move before we have gotten our act together within the European Union. That's the first step. And one of these steps is dealing with governments who are not performing to the standards that we have set together. So I think our governments need to reflect what kind of attitude we have to take beyond speeches on Sundays criticizing governments not to respect the rule of law. I think there should not be any regional, so to say, programs pumping lots of funds, European funds, into these countries if there is not a basic acceptance of the framework which we have built in the European Union. I mean, that would be really a different policy approach. I cannot see it at the moment, but I personally would think this is a prerogative of making, so to say, a step forward in this direction. And then that brings me to the Balkans and the enlargement process. I think not being capable at the moment of really pushing the Balkans into, so to say, or making progress in the enlargement process must not mean for Serbia and the other countries of the region to stagnate and not to do anything. I think you need to deliver. I think you need to do reforms. I think you need to build rule of law, bottom up, because this time must be used, and when the European Union is ready, and the time will come, maybe in not such a distant future, but it will come, then I think your societies must be ready for the standards that the European Union is so to say, asking for. It is a two-way avenue, and I think as we should be ready to take you on board, you should be ready to deliver what your societies must deliver, not for the sake of meeting European Union conditions, but for the sake of stabilizing your own societies.
Thank you. I think we have about 10 minutes left, so maybe another round of questions. Who wants to go? You have anyone? Here we go, in the front row here, please.
Thank you. Sonja Stojanović Gajić, Belgrade Center for Security Policy. There was a lot of solutions proposed during this panel, and I'm just curious, how would you deal with the politics of fear that are also very much present, both in this region but also within the EU? So instead of asking a question, what are the solutions, I'm asking a question, what are the steps to creating an atmosphere that these solutions are discussed and that avant-garde proposals are putting forward? So how could we get rid of fear promoted by populists to start discussing these solutions? That's, in a way, a question of this event.
Thank you. I think we had one here and in front as well.
Hello, Tomasz Żernaczek from the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And I'm not quite happy that my country was mentioned here that many times. But the question is not going to concern Poland. It's about the Schengen zone and the other side of the Balkans, Romania and Bulgaria. Does any of you have clue why those countries are not yet in Schengen zone, although technically they could? Thank you.
Probably answered that question with one word, but I'm not going to do that. And I think just in the front as well, sorry, if you could just bring the mic back. Sorry, if you just bring the mic back to the front here, thank you.
Hello, Vladimir Međik from European Movement. As far as I understood, in order to have the enlargement, we would have to have European Union ready to accept new member states, but also new member states ready to be accepted. Does this mean that Europe is going to abandon the approach of accepting democracy in Western Balkans versus imposing rule of law as a prerequisite for membership?
Okay, thank you. Maybe Stephen, do you want to begin? First of all, why are Romania and Bulgaria not in the Schengen zone yet?
That's a good question. You should ask the Dutch government, especially. So I'm not in a particularly good position to answer that, I suppose. But Romania and Bulgaria have been the only countries so far subjected to a verification and cooperation mechanism post-accession, as a result, of course, of some of the enlargement fatigue and criticism that had befallen the enlargement policy as a technocratic process in preparation of these countries to join those that had joined in 2004. So I suppose the answer lies partially in other elements included in that or covered by that verification mechanism, as well as domestic politics in the Netherlands. I'm not sure that they're Dutch in the room, whether they feel eager to talk to you about that. On the question of how to change the mood music and channel it in a positive way. Well, frankly, maybe I'm too rosy. My new glasses perhaps. But I have a feeling that in Brussels, indeed, the mood has lifted up in a way. There are certainly problems around, no doubt, and they've been described at length. I mean, it was hard to be even more pessimistic than some of the other panel members on some of the other issues that I wanted to raise, but I decided not to. I think Brexit, as the combination of Project Fear, gone awry in a sense, has not created a kind of ripple effect throughout the European Union that everyone foresaw. Of course, the combination with Trump politics and the total mess seen in British politics as well as in the US, I think, have served as a good counterbalance to those protest voters who are not only upset, with Brussels, as they're being told by mainly nativist, populists, but we've seen, a brief, perhaps, upsurge of Euro enthusiasm with the Pulse demonstrations, lots of flag waving, European flag waving. That's waned off, but it's at least translated in a sense of a slew of proposals which is being made, and I think there are openings, at least on the political front, to start discussing them. And there's recognition, indeed, perhaps not enough, that if there's anything to be learned from the 2017 and 16 annus horribilis, namely that populists have been able to capture the imagination of so many protest voters, is that indeed politicians need to listen to their electorates. They have to be held to account. And one of the ways, of course, of channeling this at the European level would be to take up on the idea that Macron has floated of these civilian assemblies. But that's merely one way of trying to activate, civil society much more broadly, which I think can be done in a constructive way. Greece is, has ideas there in some political corners. There's been experiments already at the European level as well with the online way of engaging the population. So arguably it ought to be possible, to steal the thunder of the demagogues in a way by proposing concrete examples of where the EU adds value to what people's individual governments cannot achieve individually.
And Ian, do you think that one example of those concrete opportunities that Stephen was mentioning might be, once the dust has settled, once the divorce has been finalised, once we have some sort of idea of what the future trading relationship is going to be like, of binding the United Kingdom in to foreign policy and security decision-making circles inside the EU, or at least alongside the EU?
Decision-making, I rather doubt, actually. Implementation, I can see. But it's true that the UK has been quite a major player in EU foreign policy making for a long time. In fact, one of the ironies is that if you look at the Foreign Office's priorities, they map almost exactly onto the priorities that the EU sets out in Federica Mogherini's annual message to the European Parliament on common foreign and security policy. But I don't foresee the UK leaving the club but still having a seat at the committee table when it comes to discussions of foreign policy. Unfortunately, I think that in the same way that the US manages to influence the development of EU foreign policy, the UK will certainly try to do that. And given some of the instruments that the EU has, both military and civil in terms of its development spending and so on, there's an interest on both sides in coordinating that. So we'll have to see. I mean, I just want to pick up one thing that Stephen said about politicians listening to their electorates. I think that's fine as far as it goes, and of course politicians in democracies have to listen to their electorates. But listening to the complaints that people have, sometimes politicians need to look behind what people think they are complaining about. And I think one of the problems with Brexit is that British politicians have been all too willing to go along with a narrative that blames the EU or blames migrants to the UK for problems that actually have much more to do with long-standing neglect by British governments of problems in society, problems of education, of infrastructure, and so on. So, you listen to what your electorate is saying. You don't necessarily have to accept the solutions that they propose to you.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. It went rather quickly, as I expected it would. It's a good note to finish on. So thank you very much to our 6 panelists. Thank you very much to all of you for listening and for your questions, and we'll see you a little bit later. Thanks very much.